Hello, I'm Karen Hangartner, and I'm the Project Director for the Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center, which is a project of the National Children's Advocacy Center. We are excited to bring this video series about secondary traumatic stress to you. In this video series, we have conversations with three of the foremost experts in secondary traumatic stress. And in these, we discuss how do these effects show up on individuals, and how does working in the field of secondary traumatic stress impact organizations, and then how do we conduct supervision in a way that's supportive for our staff. And then we'll also hear from Chris Newland, the Executive Director of the National Children's Advocacy Center, to talk a little bit about the role that the senior leader plays in addressing secondary traumatic stress in the organization. And how do we go about creating healthy, supportive environments that support the staff that we're working with. In this video, we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Pat Fisher. She's going to talk with us about how does secondary traumatic stress show up in our organizations? How do they impact our organizational cultures? And then what are some of the strategies that we need to be implementing to create a secondary traumatic stress informed organization? Enjoy this fascinating conversation with Pat. How did you get interested in the field of secondary trauma?
Let me turn this into a 30-second version. I'm a clinical psychologist, and my early research, going back over 30 years ago now, was in the field of women, adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and they were also, many of them, coming into the mental health center with assault histories and really serious conditions. And that was at a time when work around sexual assault and child sexual assault was in the very early stages. And in fact, we were pushing rocks uphill back then because the psychiatric textbooks were still saying only 1 in 10,000 families experienced incest. So it was the really early days. So I specialized and developed a lot of training protocols, evidence-based treatment protocols, assessment stuff, all of that, and did a great deal of work over that next decade with adult survivors of all forms of abuse and violence, and in all kinds of settings. And in all of that work, I also became a specialist with sex offenders and the whole forensic system. And so it was a full tour of duty around all the ways that trauma occurs with people. And then what became really evident around about the sort of early to mid-90s was the impact that doing this work was having on all of our folks, the people who are working with these highly traumatized populations. And so I, along with the other folks in the field at that point, became really concerned with how do we understand what this is about, why it's having that kind of impact on us. And that was in the stages too when folks, Lorianne Perlman, Soquitney, David Finkelhor, people were starting to look at issues around compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress. All of those notions were starting to bubble up and work was happening. So I started my own research protocols looking at the whole characteristics of our workplace, which were not only our exposure to trauma, both indirect trauma and direct trauma, but also what was going on in terms of the amplification of stressors that were happening for people in our workplaces, because the way work was being done was also rapidly shifting at that point with the whole drive towards leaner, meaner, and restricting resources. So we were seeing this hugely amplified stress environment for people. So that was sort of the direction I was coming at this from, both as a researcher, a practitioner, a policymaker, all of that. And so for that first decade, through the mid-90s to the first 5 years of this century, I was really looking at how do we address this and provide really good resources and training for people who are exposed to all of this. So all of that programming. The next thing that seemed really important to me was what was the role of supervisors and managers in these systems? Because it was also very clear that our supervisors and managers were under tremendous amounts of pressure. And the way they were doing their work and intersecting with the frontline people was having a great deal of impact on whether it was either mitigating these stress effects or whether it was amplifying them. So again, a lot of research and programming and resources around that. And then more recently, in the last real 10 years actually, is looking at what are the characteristics of organizations which are dealing with trauma-exposed populations. Because they, again, that next level up, they look different from other kinds of organizations. So again, all the research practice, etc., around how do we address this, what's going on there, and what do we understand. And I think one of the most pressing issues in many ways is that in this last decade, 15 years, there's been the huge impact of the demographic turnover. And that, high levels of turnover, all sorts of new generations coming into the workforce, and of course, what that's meant in terms of technology, communications, the information revolution, all of these factors have played a really big part. And many of them hold opportunities to potentially mitigate stressors, and others of them are providing a great deal more stress. And we actually are sort of in much more turbulent systems these days while we're dealing with really high impact materials. So it is systems we're looking at that have so many moving parts. So I think one of the really important pieces here is that you're dealing with so many moving parts in these hyper complex systems now. And that's actually the good news, because it means there's so many avenues that we can start intersecting with to start moving things in a better direction. If you're dealing with a really simple system and there's only 2 levers to pull, if you can't pull either of those levers, you're kind of hooped. Whereas we've got really complex systems, so there's so many avenues of entry. And so the more we're understanding the complexity of these systems and all of these different components, the more opportunity we have to be able to meet an organization or a system where it is right now, and then see where does it make sense to start moving it? What's the art of the possible here?
What role does the organization play in creating work environments that are supportive and protective for staff?
That's such an interesting question, because I think if you sort of pull way, way back and look at it, when you hold an awareness of the consequences to the capacity of any organization or any system, when it's carrying such a high burden of people who are struggling and who are really impacted by the high press of the work, and you're seeing all of those stress effects, clearly that's not really optimal. So this is one of those happy circumstances where the ethics of this actually are in exact alignment with the pragmatic reality of this. We need to have the healthiest possible staff in order to be maximally functional and to be able to meet our mandates. I come from the farm originally, and so the kind of notion would be we're going to run a dairy farm with a bunch of starving cattle who are not being well fed and never get to see any pasture. You're not going to have great output. We need healthy organisms in order for them to function in the best way possible. That's the pragmatic part. All of us, I think, can also buy into clearly the moral and ethical imperative in this. And I think there's another piece in this, which is a kind of congruence. We're doing the work because we believe it is important and it holds moral value in the world. How do you hold congruence if you say, we're going to do this really important work and we're going to fry our people out? That is so asymmetric. That can't work. It's not sustainable. And I think most people get it in their guts. So we come back to the whole notion of awareness and people knowing how this stuff works. And then they can hold some accountability for that at the organizational level.
What does a secondary trauma-informed organization look like?
I think that you're not going to find one answer to that. I think, again, because we have so many moving parts involved in this, parts that will be important underlying all of it is, first of all, a literacy around the issues of secondary traumatic stress and the outcomes, but that literacy flows across the entire system. So all the way from frontline people, through supervisors, through senior management, through board members. When you have got that kind of full literacy and awareness, then you're in a position to start moving into practical approaches that make sense inside of the way that organization functions. And again, you're going to have all kinds of ecological differences between different organizations, but you're not going to be able to work with what's going to be most effective here if you don't even have literacy that we have an issue and that it's safe and it's trustworthy and we can talk about this.
Can organizations themselves become traumatized?
Absolutely. And many of us in the field have either worked in them or we have colleagues who've worked in them. And a traumatized organization in many ways looks an awful lot like a traumatized person. It's just scrambling to do the basics. Things are falling off the table all the time. It is not able to do forward thinking. It's in crisis management mode all the time. And part of what will happen there is that when people and organizations are in crisis management mode, they're doing that black and white reactive thinking. And so something comes up, there's a huge reaction to it, and then the next reaction, and then they're finding they're spending so much of their time and energy dealing with unintended consequences of those reactive decisions that they made because they couldn't be grounded to see what are the consequences if we go this way, that way, and understanding things in a much more complex frame. So they're tough places to be in. They fry people out, and fried people don't make the best decisions.
How does an organization make it safe and normal to talk about secondary trauma at every level?
Again, in our experience, because we get to work with organizations all across North America, it kind of depends on the organizational culture and what the starting point is. And in organizations, typically what we end up seeing is organizations who are at one or the other end of the spectrum, organizations that are actually doing pretty well and they want to do better. And they may not know anything about secondary trauma, but they're capable groups. And so they actually have an appetite to learn, what is this, how does this work? And so you're walking into a pretty stable environment. And so that first piece is developing awareness and literacy and normalizing, how does this stuff work? What are normalized kind of outcomes for it? And then, there's room to start working with what then must we do. That's the optimal side of it. The other side, which we tend to see more often, is organizations who have bottomed out. They're in real trouble at this point. They're really suffering. And so in those situations, typically we or others who do the kind of thing that we do would come in because it's a massive crisis at this point. They're just bleeding out. They're losing staff. Their turnovers through the roof. They're just having terrible challenges. So at that point, it's all not unlike taking an individual into therapy. First, you're needing to sort of stabilize the system a little and then be able to start moving into what then can we do. Part of stabilizing the systems too, though, is that psychoed piece with normalizing what they're experiencing, fitting their experience into our understanding of what happens to individuals, teams, and organizations in a high trauma exposed environment. And all of a sudden, that starts removing some of that individual stigma and introducing more compassion in the system. And there, from there, you can then start leveraging up about what we need to do at the sort of frontline individual level for people, how we need to help and support supervisors, and then how we need to support senior management.
What are some specific strategies organizations can implement to create more supportive and protective environments?
The first stage for an organization is for them to actually have a grasp of how much stress and press they're experiencing. How high is their exposure? And so that's the first piece for them to get on board. And again, we can't hold people accountable for not knowing what they don't know. So that first piece is, holy cow, we really are in a very high trauma-exposed environment. We've got a lot coming at us. Okay, if we get that one locked in, then the next piece, given that, is what do we need to start moving? I think the first piece is typically training, psychoed training around how does this work? What are the characteristics of STS and the overall high stress environment that we're working in? What are the kinds of outcomes that come with it? Absolutely normal outcomes. What are some of the imperatives for us at, first of all, the individual level in terms of self-care that we can do? What are some of the basics that we can use inside of our teams? And just begin that first awareness and equipping people to start looking at how they can actively start mitigating this and moving this forward. The next step, I think, is how we start training our supervisors and managers, our leadership people. Because again, they're the meat in the sandwich and they are so often neglected, but they're critical for how this is going to play out. So again, equipping them and giving them training around how this works for them as leaders with the teams that they're supervising. What are the team needs? And again, frameworks around how to understand that, and then processes that will be helpful for them. And then also, what are their needs as supervisors and how are those being met? And as we move this forward, we kind of go from the place of, first of all, the needs assessment. We got that it's a big deal. Then we start looking at what we can do that's helpful to learn how to address it. And so there's a lot of actual training and learning there. And then the third step really is, how far along are we in implementation? Because we can get to the place where people have information, but that doesn't mean they're applying it. So then what are the things that will help them move this forward? What are some of the barriers to it? And it's very much an evolutionary or developmental kind of process in an organization. So you're trying to build in something that is sustainable, self-replicable. You're building competency into the full organization. But often you're starting from a place where they don't even know they have a problem. Well, they know they have a problem, but they have no idea what this really is and how STS fits into this.
What are some good policies you've seen organizations implement?
Well, I think that, again, given the social ecology of each organization, it's going to look a little bit different, and it's going to grow out of the basic principles. I think some of the basic principles involved are how are people at all levels feeling connected with the value and meaning of their work. That is one of the bigger protectants for folks, if we can keep grounding in that what we're doing holds real value. So everything from how that's incorporated into good supervision and supervision at all levels. We don't just supervise frontline people. We have supervision and peer supervision for supervisors, for people in leadership series. And people feeling really equipped to do the job and not at the end of the diving board, and feeling a real sense of safety and community. So again, supervision, peer supervision groups, all the ways in which we build safe, trusting relationships for folks. And that gives so much support for people. It also comes into how we're shifting the culture, because the end of the day, we're really embedding a different cultural set here. Many of the helping professions have this kind of implicit bias that you are supposed to give all. And if you have maybe teeny little fraction left over at the end, you might give some of that as self-care. Well, given the level of press that people are under, this is not sustainable. So, we all know how difficult it can be for people. So I think one of the big things too is we need to start shifting and normalizing all the way through the system. I like to think of it as the metaphor that we move from that old equation in the helping profession, which is either I will help you or I'll help me. If I help me, I'm selfish and bad, so I'm just going to help you and you and you and you, and I may get some crumbs at the end. Doesn't work. Me to move from that equation to one of the airline metaphor. I have to be breathing oxygen. I have to be intact so that I can help you. So it moves from an either-or equation to an and equation. And that is a huge cultural shift. And of course, one of our problems is that when any of us are under press and stress, what we're going to do is we're going to regress to the old way of doing things, not a new, more cognitively complex way. So we also have to be able to have cultural support from each other to be able to say, oxygen mask, you're running off into that other place again. We need to really be looking at a thorough way of how we have congruence between how we are taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of each other, so that we can take care of our clients over the long term and remain healthy. So practices that support that in different organizations are going to look different. If you've got a centralized organization, you probably have some real opportunity to have a lot of team activities, frequent meetings, peer debriefing groups, all sorts of things that you can start doing. And you have all sorts of options too in terms of management, being able to support each other. When you have more decentralized teams, then you start looking at, okay, how do we start effectively making this happen when there may be huge geographic separation? And so in some of those, we're seeing people using new technologies. And so they're having video meetings on a weekly basis. The conference call with the thing in the middle of the table typically is absolutely dreary and deadly and never works. So I never advocate for those. We need to see each other's eyes. It's most effective if we can be in the same room, but if we can't, if we can see each other and we can build strategies around that. And one of the things that we've done a lot of with is developing and providing sets of strategies and ways of coming at all of this. But the strategy on its own, when it's segregated from why we're doing it, is not going to be useful. We really need people to understand the whys. And then from there, they can start looking at what's going to help us do these things.
After a really tough case, is critical incident stress management a good strategy for organizations to use?
The traditional CISM approach has been well researched, certainly over the last 20 plus years. And certainly there are real concerns about how effective that is. And in fact, in some cases and instances for people, it can be counterproductive and not helpful. I think, again, if you have a well-informed workforce and supervisory group, and you already have in place good supervision, individual and group supervision, you have a resource there that you can start stepping into when critical incidents happen. One of the big characteristics around trauma is that when something really awful happens to you, you haven't had any control over it. What we don't want to do is duplicate that in an effort to help you. You have no control over it. I'm forcing you to come and I'm forcing you to speak in front of all of these people. We can be just enhancing the whole trauma response. So we're always wanting to look at what is going to be helpful for that individual, where are they sitting with this, how well do they understand their own needs, and how can we support them. We never, ever want to force somebody to do anything. We certainly want to invite them into a range of options that we have already discussed with each other. We know are available when things like this happen, and then support the individual of stepping into what it is they need and continue to check in with them, but not in a stocky kind of way.
Can you explain the complex stress model?
Again, this one came about because with the emergence of the initial work around secondary traumatic stress and all the work that we already knew about the impact of primary trauma, direct trauma that happens to somebody, we're looking at our organizations where we have exposure to both direct and indirect trauma. So we know the trauma story and how that works. But that clearly wasn't covering the full flavor of what people were experiencing. The other piece of it is all of the systemic-based stressors. And that's to do with organizations in the workplace, across all workplaces, IBM, Wendy's, wherever we're going to have elements of these. And again, that whole area is very well mined out. And there's three major categories under the systemic stressors for organization. The first of them is all of the job stress literature, everything we know about job stress and the characteristics of demand control, social support, et cetera, et cetera. There's about 13 factors in there. Then all of the burnout literature we have in terms of just press and inside of any kind of workplace that can lead to classic Maslow-style burnout, where the person really is suffering very serious injury at the further end of it. And then all of the issues around discrimination, bullying, harassment. So that cluster all falls into the systemic stressors. And what we'd often find when we'd go into some organizations, certainly in the earlier years, is people would say, I can handle the clients, but it's the kind of stuff that's going on I'm being subjected to inside of the way the work is structured that's killing me. And so being able to see when we have both of these kinds of vectors of stress coming in on people, the traumatic stressors and the systemic stressors, what we were finding is 2, 3, 4 times the level of negative outcome than we would be looking at for folks who were only dealing with one side of that equation. So they actually kind of cross-potentiate each other. So it's a much, much more escalated stress environment that way. So coming back, that again gives us so many more levers to work with. There are elements of some of the traumatic stressors that we're subjected to, like the nature of the population, the kinds of stories or the kinds of stuff we're going to be subjected to that we can't change. But the way we encounter the workplace can make a lot of difference in mitigating how much that's going to impact us. And some of the things that keep coming up top of heap are things like the quality of social support and engagement we have with our colleagues. And we all know when we have a really good connection with our colleagues, it's safe, it's trusting, we are so much more robust. But if we're isolated, either geographically or socially, we're that much more vulnerable. You know, the kinds of issues around just working conditions. You know, there's a lot we can do to optimize that. And then, of course, the harassment, bullying, all of that kind of stuff is absolutely deadly. And so you can think about this kind of assaultiveness going on for somebody in any workplace is a big deal. For that to be going on for somebody who's also dealing with really high-level trauma exposure, that's crushing. And so you start seeing how these are intersecting with each other and how many points of entry you have to turn it the right way around and to really increase the overall resiliency of folks.
What's the intersection between basic organizational health and individual traumatic stress?
What's helpful in the organizational health model, and this is the one that's 10 years old, 12 years old now, anyhow. And if you were able to see the graphic, really what it determined is there's really 12 factors we're looking at when we're describing organizational health. And what's most important about them is the way they're related to each other. So what we sort of found conceptually and theoretically is that the three base factors that everything else is an outcome of is employee health and wellness, leadership, the capacity of leadership, and succession planning, the turnover piece. And so the employee health and wellness is a cornerstone. When we're going into the organizations that we work with, typically, what we'll be finding is often around 25 to 30+% of folks would meet diagnostic criteria for clinical depression. Anxiety spectrum disorders typically in 40+% of folks. Serious sleep disturbance in well over 50% of folks. Those are just a few of the metrics. So you start looking at this and you're thinking, we're expecting phenomenal performance from a group of people who are carrying such a burden of stress effects. That's not fair. It won't work. So this is the piece where the complex stress model and the outcomes of stress sort of sit there as a cornerstone in terms of the actual capacity of the individuals that we have in our organization. That goes over next door to the quality of the leadership. Leaders are people too. So many of them are really struggling. And so we need our leaders to be as well trained. And again, most people who come into leadership roles just kind of get plunked there. Nobody's giving them training. They're doing their best, but they don't have the supports or the knowledge base to really support them in doing the work they're doing. So that piece is critical. That middle piece is a foundation level, is the succession planning piece. And that's the part that really speaks to this tremendous shift in our workforces over the last 20 years, from what were typically pretty stable groups of folks with low turnover to areas now where we're looking at very high levels of turnover. And so you start seeing how that plays out. We know that when someone is new in position, they may be an experienced worker, but it's a new position. It's typically 1 year till they're getting up to basic competency and 2 years till they're getting up to full expertise. If we have a system where we have 10 people and we've got, in the good old days, 9 of them really well experienced and say they're all healthy, they're working 100%, one person who's struggling, capacity of that 10 group people would be sitting at about 95%. But our reality now is we got that group of 10 people, we've got 5 of them who are brand new. They're not up to full capacity yet because they're brand new. Some of them are not very healthy. They're really struggling emotionally and physically. So their capacity's cut down even further. Then we've got the really experienced people who are fried because we've got so many new people that the experienced people are having to work triple time to try to compensate for the other. All of a sudden, the functional capacity of that group of 10 people has shrunk down to about 52%. But what we as organizations are typically saying is we expect you've got 10 bodies and 10 seats. We expect you to be at full capacity and handle full caseload. Well, that's not structurally possible. So part of it too is looking at how do we keep people well? How do we stabilize turnover? How do we support our leaders so that they can be in the best shape possible? So we're going to stabilize our system and equip it. And then the other outcome variables of org health start making sense. Communication capacity goes up. Respect and sort of interpersonal regard. The ability for people to lead more balanced and healthy lives. When you start looking further up too, training and how our training environment is sticking. Again, you could have the best training in the world, but if you're providing it to people who are anxious, burnt, fried, and they think I only was given this yesterday because they probably think I'm a loser, how well is that training going to stick? So as we move further and further up the ladder of the characteristics of organizational health, the capacity to work effectively in teams, turnover issues, all of these things are going to be much implicated by what is our base here in terms of the health and wellness of individuals, capacity of leadership, and stabilizing that turnover.
What causes high turnover in the workforce?
Oh, that's such a wonderful, complex question. We could go on for days about that one. But I think part of it is if we did a flashback, a before and an after, a lot of things start flushing out. If we go back before, we're looking 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the way the workplace was organized was completely different. We weren't embedded in the midst of the full IT information revolution. And we had the vast majority of our workforce were the baby boomers. And so their whole cultural imperative was to get into the job, stay there, and then retire. And they used telephones and they wrote letters. And they actually had reflective time to problem solve. And there was much more connection inside of the system. Everybody knew where the bodies were buried because they'd all been around forever. We flash forward to now, and we've essentially shed the baby boomers. They're not there anymore. And we've got now 4 different generations of workers in the workforce. And the largest majority of our workers are on this side of the digital divide. They have grown up with all of that digital media and that literacy, and they actually function and think very differently, and there's much different kind of pace. We have that proportion, probably around 40% of our workforce now, which is on the older side of the digital divide, and they're folks who are still, this was not their first language. They're not native speakers of it yet. And so many of them are feeling sort of real pressure and are slightly alienated, and they have a kind of different way of wanting to go about doing work. The younger generations typically are looking at staying in jobs not much more than 5 years. We're lucky if we can hold on to them for 5 years. This, again, is leading to a lot more turbulence in our system because the expectations are different. And because we shed so many people with the turnover originally, we moved into a situation, too, where we have much higher and rapid movement through hierarchies and systems. And then if we come back again to the notion of 1 year for competency, 2 years for expertise, when we have systems that are in this constant kind of tumult, we have an enormous shrinkage in the capacity of that system, and it's also an increased stress inside of that system, and everybody's feeling it. So if ever there was a need for people to take it down 14 notches and get grounded, it's even more imperative now than it's ever been. We are more challenged with that now than we have ever been. And I think it's helpful to be aware that we're at a position in human history right now which we have never encountered before, in that the density and intensity of information that we're having to manipulate is greater than it's ever been. Our challenge to separate signal from noise is immense, and the level of expectation for performance has never been higher. In some ways, it's almost like a perfect storm right now, and we don't have a lot of history in this, so we're right now at this really creative space of figuring out what can work. How do we harness this? How do we move this into functional, long-term, sustainable kinds of systems that are delivering in our whole trauma-exposed field? We're delivering the services that are necessary if you're going to have a civil society. So at the biggest level, this is absolutely critical that we make this stuff work.
How does a secondary trauma-informed organization address productivity?
And this is such an important issue. So if we come back to the understanding of how much impact on capacity we're seeing by workers and people in our system who are struggling with symptoms and outcomes of the stress overwhelm, and also looking at the turbulence piece. If we go back to that graphic, I think we need to think about productivity in a very different way, in a much more sophisticated way than we used to. We used to think that if I've got a team of 10 people and I've got 10 bodies in there, it makes perfect sense that we're going to have caseloads of X, and that should be achievable. That came from the golden old days when we had 10 people in there who were fully up to speed, had been doing it forever, who were really well connected with each other, very well trained, And the work that they were doing wasn't as complicated as it is now, because we have much more knowledge base than we had then. So it can be really frustrating for people in leadership to say, well, you've got all your positions filled. How come you're not being able to keep up with it? This is where we have to have the more sophisticated view of it. In those 10 people, I have got 6 who are brand new at this. They're not at 100% capacity. Even if they're healthy, they're not at 100% capacity. And in fact, typically, about half of them are going to be really struggling. So they're even at less capacity. Then in my experienced people, well, one of them's actually off on stress leave, so they're not contributing anything, and we don't have any backfill these days because we don't have money for that. So of the remaining 4, 3 of those 4 are struggling to various degrees because there is so much additional pressure on them. And of course, the new people in there are not going to those experienced people any more than they absolutely have to, because they can see that these people are struggling. So the new people are floundering and they're making some errors. And so they're actually being counterproductive in some ways. So as we look at the total functional capacity of this group of 10 people, it has now shrunk immensely. And we're lucky if we're getting 50%, and that's a reality. So when we're sitting there pounding on our desk and saying, why can't you do 100%? Well, they can't. It's kind of like looking at a marathon runner who's got double pneumonia and saying, I want you to post your best time. You can't do it. So our task is to have a more realistic appreciation of what is the actual capacity of this given group of people, and then what can we do to enhance that capacity. For starters, we want them all to be as well as they can possibly be, because that's going to increase capacity, obviously. And then we want to stabilize the movement through so that people are able to get past basic competency up to some levels of expertise. So this is really going to shift things. What we also work with and we've got numbers of tools around this and metrics for folks to look at their teams, is say you also are in a situation where you have a team where people have been there forever with each other. They're really, a very high productive team. What you need to do is prepare for the next 3 to 5 years. They're probably a really productive team because they've been there forever with each other, and half of them are going to retire in the next 2 years. All of a sudden, that team's going to catapult into a team where it's got a whole mess of brand new people, probably even a brand new leader. So the level of capacity is going to shrink dramatically. So how much does it behoove us to start preparing for that, doing the cross-training, getting people who can step in, who can be at a higher level capacity than just brand new, and that we're already starting to build the kind of collegial connections between folks, because that piece, the relational piece inside of that team, is so critical. So we need to look at where we are right now, where we've been, and where we're going to be in a much, much more realistic way.
I've heard you say that professionals have an ethical obligation to ensure that their job is doable by one person. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And we see that a lot, and I think it is also deeply embedded in culture norms inside of organizations. And again, it's sort of helpful if we look backwards to where we come from. And so again, if we go back 10, 15 years, the norm was almost this kind of mission-driven martyrdom place. What we're doing is so darn important, and I'm going to give my life over to it entirely. And people would overfunction hugely. And that was normalized. It was celebrated. It was part of culture. That was primarily the boomers generation. As they waved out, we had the folks that they supervised and trained, that mid-generation, people who are sort of in their mid-40s up to their mid-50s-ish now, and upper 50s. And some of them certainly took that on. As we look generationally down, for the most part, we're finding people who are younger, in their 30s and 20s. That is not their culture. and they do not want to sacrifice their lives for their work. They want to have lives and meaningful work. So we've got this shifting kind of culture benchmark. One of the real imperatives at this point for us in any kind of leadership role or supervisory role is we need to look at, by the time we're leaving, is the job that we're doing a doable job for somebody else in a sane kind of way? And it means in some ways we're shifting our notion of what's the moral, right, and ethical thing to do. And I don't know how many times, particularly with boomers, I saw them crawling up to the end of their career with their last blood and doing their damnedest, handing the torch off to the next person who's one or two generations below them. And that next person realizing very swiftly this was not a doable job. And then they would leave that job. And then it would go to the next person. And the job itself degraded and minimized because you didn't have anybody who could really do it. And so the capacity and the information retention inside of that system is just reducing and reducing. So if we want sustainable systems, it's a moral imperative, really, for us to make our jobs doable, so that we can then bring along new people, hold the torch off to them. They can step into it with increased capacity. They can actually have a life and be healthy human beings and do that job. And that's a real difference, and it's a culture difference.